Broadly speaking, there are two core stages of consuming written information or reading. First stage is consumption, and the second stage is digestion. Now, it's important to note that it isn't actually possible to remember literally everything that you learn. In fact, even if we could do so, it would not be ideal at all. There was one such person who actually had a brain condition who did allow him this ability. His condition was called FG syndrome. In other words, he did not have the cluster of neurons to connect the right hemisphere of his brain to the left. In other words, the corpus callosum. This resulted in his brain adapting to form its own new cluster to compensate, which then caused him to remember everything in hyperspecific detail. He could read a book once and recite it back to you word for word, verbatim, punctuation in precisely the correct positions with no error at all. However, he was therefore unable to reason and problem solve as a consequence. People like Kim Peek, the guy with this condition, could perform very well, excellently at tasks that required a low order of learning. And by the way, when I reference orders of learning here, I'm referencing the Solo taxonomy and Bloom's revised taxonomy. But he would be outperformed by any normal individual who has the corpus callosum intact and can reason and solve problems if competing on tasks that demand a higher order of learning. They actually made a movie about this guy, Kim Peek. The movie's called Rain Man. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's a brilliant movie. Dr. Justin Sung, a fellow YouTuber, and learning scientist, I should also add, has a system for remembering what you learn and for more effectively recalling what you read. And it focuses more so on remembering everything that you need to recall as opposed to remembering everything in general. He has developed a system for doing this quite effectively, but the correct process must be applied to the appropriate corresponding categories of information type, namely during the consumption stage, lest you spend more time and effort than necessary to get merely subpar results. And nobody wants that, right? Then we must digest and reflect on what we've consumed in order to store it from the sensory memory to the short-term memory and then to the long-term memory. The process of doing this sort of digestion stage is referred to as encoding in learning science. The consumption and digestion stages must be completely balanced at all times, though. What goes into the brain is far less imperative than what remains there. More time spent consuming, as a consequence of the natural human forgetting curve, naturally leads to less effective results than the oppositional approach, that is, to spend more time on digestion and deep processing the information consumed. The more time spent processing, the more of an education one can be said to possess. Dr. Justin Sung's system has been, he called it the PACER system, I believe. P-A-C-E-R. The P represents procedural information. In other words, how do I use this information? You want to apply this information in proper practice as soon as you possibly can to reduce the potential of forgetting critical pieces of it. Then we have the A, which represents analogous information. This is information related to something that we already know, pre-existing knowledge. This is when we learn new information that reminds us of knowledge that we already possess. Digestion is almost effortless here when present at all. And even when present, it's not in the way of understanding conceptually, but rather in the way of building further connections. Here's an example. If I'm learning muscle contractions and I'm a swimmer, then I may be reminded of a certain movement of the arm during swimming when looking over a visual representation of the way that a given muscle in the arm moves during a given contraction. This creates an analogy. It pays to consider potential connections like these when consuming anything. The accompanying activity for this one is to critique. How far or deep can I extend this analogy? When does this analogy stop working or diverge? Might there be a better, more accurate, or more suitable analogy than the one I'm currently using? This actually reminds me of schema fit, but that's a different conversation or a different video. Now we move on to the C in PACER, which represents conceptual information. In other words, what this information is. Procedural information is often used in tandem with conceptual information to solve problems and apply knowledge. This kind of information is constituted by facts, data, and general concepts. Therefore, procedural information would be how to use the conceptual information. The activity connected to this type of information is mapping. This essentially means that I need to take notes on this information in a non-linear, interleaving rooted manner, in a way that preferably utilizes picture-based notes and forms connections to other concepts and facts, which forces me to conceive of the information from various perspectives and to group concepts together with each other at literally as much as possible. While exploring the conceptual information, analogies may be discovered and can then be included into the mapping process, or even if they don't get included into the map, the connection via analogy will serve to further strengthen the knowledge gained through this process of digestion. It could also inform the structure of the ideas within the mapping process. Then we have the E in PACER, which represents evidence information. In other words, proving, clarifying, etc. conceptual information. So this is typically information that provides evidence or vindication for conceptual information. For example, if I know conceptually how and why World War II began and ended, then knowing the meticulous details such as names, dates, titles, and milestones, etc., that serve as evidence for the broader concept of World War II would effectively mean that I had the evidential information regarding the conceptual information in this respect. The activity associated with evidence information is to store and rehearse. Storing effectively means to collect and archive in a safe place, and this could be a conceptual map, flashcards, Obsidian, Notion, or Roam, or some other digital tool of the like, physical documentation, and so on. This needs to happen immediately after it's identified. Rehearsing comes a bit later in the process of spacing, interleaving, and retrieval. This simply means that we must reflect on and consider how this piece of information will be used and applied in context. Bringing this back to the idea of interleaving, this could look like problem solving, explaining, answering questions, teaching material, and a lot more. All with evidence tied into its corresponding conceptual info and both used together in context and supporting each other. Another utility could be to write essays or mini essays that use the evidence information to provide further instruction, context, or vindication for a conceptual topic. Furthermore, be careful here to not focus too much cognitive energy on writing obsessive notes and trying to memorize every little detail of something during the consumption stage. Kind of like highlighting everything that you see on every single page of a book the first time that you read it. It's ineffective, and it's a waste of the cognitive energy that you will need for the deep processing. This E stage requires the previous stages before arriving at it. Otherwise, the foundation, stages P, A, and C, will not have been laid for the house, stage E, to be sensibly constructed. Now we have the R in the PACER system, which represents reference information. This is hyper-specific detailed information that, while it may not significantly impact the broader conceptual understanding of a topic, it may be some minuscule piece of info that, when paired with other hyper-specific details, constitutes a whole of something that might serve as a piece of evidential information or otherwise useless information with respect to the broader understanding of the subject matter. An example of this type of information might be the particular composition of the molecular structure of dopamine in the broader topic of neurochemistry in relation to sexual intercourse. Or it could be a list of particular attributes that are used to define a variable in coding. The process used for this type of information is almost the same as what is used for evidential information. Store and rehearse. Storing is exactly the same as the evidential counterpart here. However, due to the differences in rehearsal methods between evidence info and reference info, it may be useful to use such differences in the rehearsal element to inform the particular approach for storage. The best way to use reference type information is to use spaced repetition and active recall, perhaps with something like physical flashcards or even a software like Anki. Most times this info will be used in citing, details and straight facts from memory. It's not very often, if ever, that this sort of information is used in active problem solving, for example. And lastly, you want to go through reference info and evidence info at least once per day for approximately 30 minutes. This has been a pretty condensed video, and probably will end up shorter than most of my other content so far on this channel, but this is a learning system that I found very useful for myself and that I wanted to share with you guys. And so I hope you guys got something out of this today, and as always, thank you guys for tapping in with me. This has been Caven. This is all I got for y'all today. Ciao.